You will never be as good as your mother, and I'm relieved she's dead." The words slipped from Cambria's lips like a knife, cold, cruel, and all too real. Not because I hadn't heard it before, but because this was the first time she said it out loud, without disguise, without the usual facade of propriety. In front of everyone. Her hands swung up so quickly I almost didn't have time to react. A sharp smack echoed in the glittering space of the banquet hall, where rows of white cloth tables, crystal glasses, and flickering candlelight were providing the backdrop to a moment no one wanted to witness. I staggered a step, my head tilting to the right by instinct, my cheek burning as if it had been seared. In an instant, all the sound drained away, no more soft jazz music, no more clinking glasses in celebration. There was only the sound of breaking glass. The red wine glass in my hand fell to the floor, shattering like blood spilling from a heart stabbed at its weakest point. It was the color of the times I tried to hold back tears so I wouldn't upset my father. The color of the letters my mother wrote in desperation. The color of the childhood dreams that Cambria had shredded, piece by piece. I didn't cry. I didn't lower my head. I looked straight at her, the woman whose face was now twisted in anger. But in my eyes, she no longer had any power. She had thought I would collapse, that I would leave like I always had. But today was different. Today was my father's birthday, and it was also the day I chose to no longer remain silent. I wiped my cheek. The red mark still stung. But my voice was calm, clear, every word etched into the air. Then it's time for me to tell everything. Everything. In front of everyone. And I saw it, the flicker of shock in her eyes. For the first time, it was Cambria who couldn't control the stage she had thought she'd set up so perfectly. All eyes turned to me. No one breathed loudly. No one dared move. And I began to peel back the layers that had hidden the truth for 2 decades. I am Lyna, 34 years old, the only daughter of Richard Greystone, the founder of the renowned law firm Greystone and Miles in Boston, the exemplary father in the eyes of the public, the man I once admired to the point of madness. And also the man who had closed his eyes and turned a blind eye throughout my childhood. My mother, Eliza, died suddenly in a car accident when I was only 13. On the day of the funeral, I still remember the smell of rain and the black dress I didn't want to wear. I trembled as I looked at my mother lying motionless, her hands cold as ice. I hadn't had the chance to say, "I love you" for the last time. I thought I would forever remember my mother in that excruciating pain. But then, just 2 months later, Cambria appeared. She entered our house like a strange wind, bringing the scent of expensive perfume, soft words, and a smile that never reached her eyes. My father introduced her as an old friend of his. I remember her handshake when I first met her. It was cold, slippery, as if I were holding something unreal. "Hello, Lyna. Your mother must have been a wonderful person," she said, her eyes sparkling as if about to cry. But I saw in her voice a sense of triumph, the feeling that she had just placed one foot in a territory that didn't belong to her, and she would never leave. From then on, Cambria didn't need time to become a part of the house. She took over. My mother's pictures gradually disappeared from the walls, first in the living room, then the hallway, and eventually even in my own room. I remember the night I found my mother's wedding dress. The dress she had said she would keep for me to wear on my big day was thrown in the trash, wrinkled and covered in dirt. I ran into the living room, still holding the muddy dress in my hands, shouting, "Dad." Mom said she was keeping this dress for me. She threw it away. My father looked up from the pile of paperwork, sighing wearily. "Lyna, stop making trouble. Cambria is just cleaning up. You're being too sensitive. No, you don't understand. She wants to erase everything about Mom. She hates me." Cambria entered, standing behind my father, arms crossed, lips curled slightly. "She's just being difficult, darling," she said as if comforting him. "I just want to organize things, make them neat." My father looked at me, his gaze no longer patient. "You need to learn how to grow up, Lyna." I swallowed my tears, swallowed the scream in my throat. And from that moment, I learned how to stay silent. Silent when Cambria locked my room door as punishment. Silent when she mocked me in front of guests. Silent even when I caught her tearing up my mother's journals, the only thing I had left. I became the weird child in my own home. Once, I tried to speak to the school counselor, but she called home. My father picked me up in silence, his face as cold as ice. In the car, he said just one sentence: "Don't tarnish our family name any further." That night, I opened the attic door, crawling through the dust and cobwebs. I dug up the old plank on the floor, where I had hidden the wooden box containing the letters my mother had written, her handwritten notes on therapy sessions she had attended, a few old photographs, and the handkerchief my mother had embroidered my name on in red thread. I gently stroked each page, my hands trembling as if I were touching my mother's soul. I whispered, "Mom, I haven't forgotten you, even though they're trying to erase you from my life." I knew, one day, I would show the world who my mother really was. And I, Lyna Greystone, was not the crazy person Cambria wanted everyone to believe. I had been waiting for that day. And now, standing in the middle of my father's birthday party, my cheeks still burning from Cambria's slap, I realized that day had come. I wouldn't stay silent for another second. Marne, Cambria's daughter from her previous marriage, always looked at me with cold, almost contemptuous eyes. In her eyes, I was the legitimate child, the lucky heir living in a luxury home, pampered and protected by my father, Richard Greystone. She had never known that the years I spent under the same roof with her mother were long years of silence, endurance, and gradually losing myself. Everything changed one afternoon when Cambria carelessly insulted me in front of Marne. Without shouting, without arguing, I silently pulled a small envelope from my pocket, handed it to Marne, and walked away. No explanation. It was the letter my mother had written in the last week before she died, her shaky handwriting, smeared ink from tears, as if she were trying to hold onto something in her desperation. That night, I couldn't sleep. But I never expected that, just before midnight, the doorbell would ring. It was Marne, hair messy, eyes red, tightly clutching the letter I had given her earlier. "Lyna," she whispered, her voice choked. "Is it true? Everything my mother said about you is a lie?" I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my laptop, selected the video I had prepared, the recording from the camera I had secretly installed in the dining room last year. In it, Cambria's voice came through cold as ice. "You exist to remind me that Richard once loved someone more than he loved me." When the video ended, Marne sat still. The yellow light in the living room cast faint patches of light and shadow across her face. She didn't cry, nor did she say anything. But I knew something in her had just collapsed. "We have to do something." Finally, Marne spoke. Her voice was deep and firm. "If you have more, show me." And I showed her everything. The wooden box I had hidden for 2 decades, the printed emails Cambria sent to dispose of my mother's belongings, my mother's journals about her therapy sessions, the photos with faces scratched out. Each piece, each pane, each piece of evidence I had kept like a guardian of memories. Marne went silent as she read a message her mother had sent to her best friend. "Lyna isn't the problem. The problem is, she looks at me with Eliza's eyes. I can't stand that Richard keeps comparing me to someone who's dead." I thought Marne would be angry, but no. She just said one sentence I would never forget. "I used to think my mother was just a wounded woman. Now I'm afraid she's the one causing the wounds." We, the 2 children who had grown up in the darkness of Cambria, began an alliance. For the first time, we were no longer the stepchild and the biological child. No more doubt, only the truth. We silently gathered evidence, from journals, handwritten letters, to hidden cameras. We created a private database, naming it Eliza, as a way for my mother to live again amidst the things that had been denied. One night, after reviewing all the documents, I looked up at Marne, my heart full of hesitation but also some resolve. "Marne, I want to present everything at Dad's birthday party as a gift. But in reality, it's to expose everything." She widened her eyes. "Are you serious? In front of the family? Dad's friends? Aren't you afraid of being seen as ungrateful?" I smiled lightly, the first smile I had in weeks, but also the saddest smile. "I've been called ungrateful for 20 years. Another time won't make a difference. But this time, I want them to see the truth. Not just my words, but the evidence, my mother's voice, everything she left behind. That Cambria tried to hide." Marne was silent for a long time. Then she nodded. I'll help you. Not for you, but because I need to know who I am, who my mother really is. So we began to rewrite the final chapter of a story that had always had only one narrator. But this time, the truth would be spoken by those who had once been forced to stay silent. And I swore I would not let anyone else grow up doubting their own memories. The banquet room was like it was frozen in June. Ivory satin ribbons tied around the chairs, white orchid branches placed on the dining table, golden candlelight reflecting off the crystal glasses. Everything was beautiful to the point of being indifferent. Almost 60 people, relatives, longtime friends, my father's colleagues, were submerged in tense silence as I walked into the center of the room with a small clicker in hand, and the first introduction appeared on the screen. 20 years of memories no one wants to recall. I took a deep breath, glancing over the familiar faces, some trying to smile politely, others avoiding my gaze as though they were standing before something they weren't ready to face. Only my father sat up straight, his face unreadable, as if he had no idea what was about to happen. I began to speak. Not too fast, not too slow. My voice was strangely calm, like the old wounds inside me no longer bled, but had transformed into words, into evidence, into memories that could speak. Each time I clicked the button, the screen displayed an excerpt from my mother's journal, her slanted handwriting, ink smeared with tears, as if it were a last confession from a mother who knew she wouldn't be here to protect her child. I'm worried about Lyna. Cambria doesn't love her. I'm afraid that one day, when I'm gone, she'll be forgotten in the very house she was born in. A video clip played. Cambria's voice, cold, sharp as a razor, rang out in the familiar dining room setting. You exist to remind me that Richard once loved someone more than he loved me. The air in the room grew thick. A few people raised their hands to cover their mouths. Some shivered. Cambria stood up suddenly, her chair crashing to the floor with a screeching sound. Her face turned bright red, her eyes blazing with fury. She's making everything up. Eliza was delusional. She always fantasized, wrote journals like they were novels, and now the girl is using them to fabricate lies. I didn't respond. I just looked at her, with a gaze that was no longer fearful, no longer filled with rage, but a gaze from someone who had finally risen from the ashes of their own past. Then, Marne's voice rang out, not loudly, but decisively, clear like a bell in the midst of a solemn ceremony. Mom, I've seen you do this. I've heard you say those things. Don't keep going. The room fell silent for a second time. Cambria turned back, glaring at her daughter as if in disbelief. Marne stood tall, her gaze cold, but the corners of her mouth trembled as if holding back years of inner turmoil. I've stayed silent for too long, but today, I can't anymore. I looked at Marne, a mix of sadness and gratitude swelling in my chest. We had once stood at opposite ends of a fake home, both victims without knowing we had an ally. And then, my father stood up. His steps were slow and shaky, not like the powerful man who still walked into courtrooms with an expressionless face. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the final letter from my mother, which I had left at the end of my presentation as a closing statement. I saw his hand tremble as he read it. His face, finally, for the first time in my life, was no longer the expression I had feared, stern, aloof, or disappointed. It was pain, regret, a husband hearing the call from a wife who had passed. If you're reading this letter, I'm probably no longer here. But please, don't let Lyna live in a house where she isn't loved. He looked up, his eyes met mine, 20 years of being lost, now packed into a single gaze. The paper fell from his hand, swaying in the air like a mourning cloth for a past that had never been properly mourned. And then he knelt, right in the middle of the banquet hall. On the red carpet, amid the astonished stares of relatives, friends, and partners. I'm sorry, Lyna. His voice cracked. I didn't listen. I didn't see how much you were hurting. I let you live like a shadow. I'm sorry. I stood frozen. For a moment, I wanted to push him away. I wanted to scream for everything I had been through, for my lost childhood, for the many nights I had to lull myself to sleep in an unnamed fear. But then, I just bent down and hugged my father. I was no longer the 13-year-old girl who had been abandoned. I was no longer the one who had to prove that I deserved to be loved. I was the one who had kept the truth for 20 years, and today, I was letting it out. Not for revenge, but to breathe, to let my mother rest in peace, and to let myself live as a real person. Cambria left, silently, alone, with no one holding her back. In a night that was supposed to be a celebration, she lost everything she had controlled. As for me, I didn't win, nor did I lose. I just started. Started over, with my father, with Marne, and with a new chapter. A chapter of truth, healing, and the trust I had reclaimed in the very place that once pushed me out. Cambria left early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen. No one saw her off. No goodbyes, no hugs. Just the sound of the front door closing gently, so different from how she had once been in this house. Always loud, always controlling, always making others feel small. Marne stood at the gate, holding the strap of her bag tightly, her eyes distant. She and I shared a quiet hug, not needing to say much. In that hug, there was both forgiveness and solidarity between two women who had grown up under the shadow of a mother who didn't know how to love. "I need some time alone to figure out who I am," Marne said softly. I nodded. "And you deserve that." She turned and walked out of the iron gate, not as someone fleeing, but as someone starting over with her own feet. The house became quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of coldness. It felt like a garden that had just been cleared of weeds, not yet blooming, but with sunlight beginning to filter into the dark corners. My father and I didn't speak much in the first few days. We cooked dinner together, set the table together, and listened to the old music my mother used to love, Clair de Lune by Debussy, playing softly in the kitchen. Once, he silently took my hand when the music stopped. No more apologies, just the hand holding. But I understood. He was relearning how to be a father, bit by bit. One morning, I opened the old box again. My mother's mementos were still intact, the smell of old paper, the smeared ink, and the love that had never gone away. I took the picture of my mother, a portrait of her wearing a white blouse, her hair neatly tied up, smiling with a gentle gaze, and hung it back in the living room, right above the fireplace. Under the frame, I placed a small piece of paper in a wooden frame that I had carved myself. The lines I wrote with purple ink, carefully shaping each letter. Truth doesn't need permission. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it. I once thought silence was about keeping the peace, but I was wrong. Silence is an accomplice to evil, especially when that evil comes from those we call family. Forgiveness is not forgetting, it's reclaiming the right to live, no longer bound by the past. And I realized, family isn't just where you're born, it's where you're heard, where you're loved, and where you get to be yourself. Have you ever been forced to stay silent to keep the peace in your family? Would you choose forgiveness or silence if you were in Lyna's shoes? If Lyna's story stirred memories in you, leave a comment below. If you believe that the truth needs to be spoken, like this video. And if you want to follow more courageous journeys like Lyna's, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out.